for most people, political behavior is emotional. It's not intellectual. But the whole framework that we have to understand it, right? Your entire field of political science, half of what I do in political consulting, sort of tries to take what is fundamentally an emotional choice and dress it up in a box of intellectualism, right? And tries to rationalize it and tries to get people to think about much baser decisions intellectually. And I think that's where, our tools are set up for a kind of voting that most people don't do.
Hello, thank you for joining us and welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what is going on in U.S. politics in 2024. We also care deeply about pastries. Today, we are going to discuss two related but tricky topics, and they have to do with both polling and the Electoral College, specifically with what's going on in 2024. I want to start us off with a little discussion of polling. Polling has been, as we all know, a little tricky in the era of Donald Trump. Both in 2016 and in 2020, polls pretty consistently underestimated his support by about 3 or 4 points. Now, historically, that's not a huge miss overall for polls, but in an era where elections are so close, where they're usually decided by less than 3 or 4 points, it's obviously a concern. And the fact that the polls missed his vote share consistently and in the same direction have led many pollsters to seek some new ways of adjusting for this to try and make the polls for 2024 more accurate. John, I'd like to start off by asking you, what is your best sense of why the polls were systematically off regarding Trump in the last 2 election cycles, and how do we see people trying to adjust for this today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I want to start by sort of defending pollsters.
Okay.
The polls were off a couple points in 16 and 20. They were, but they also, a lot of what was happening is that there was a lot of really late movement. A lot of the in 16 in particular, a lot of people kind of convinced themselves after the debates that the race was over. And, I think most reliable polling showed that after the debates, Clinton did open up a lead. But then, we forget it was late October when Jim Comey came out and said that they were reopening the investigation. There was legitimate late movement. There were understandable and rational reasons why undecided voters moved toward Trump at the end. Obviously, as a Democrat, I didn't. But, the polls that were conducted, a couple of weeks before the election showed that the race was tightening. So, I think we overstate how bad the polls were, particularly in 2016. In 2020, some of the polls overestimated the Biden advantage for sure. But, again, it was a dynamic time. It's hard to always separate out when is a poll wrong and when is a poll done too early. So I think I want to start there.
It is.
But I do think that there are some serious systematic challenges that polls faced. One of them was, and I did a lot of research on this and actually went on Meet the Press Daily with Chuck Todd to talk about it. If you want to go look that one up in the archives. But one of the things that we worked at a company that I used to work at called Clarity Campaign Labs, we spent a lot of time digging into partial survey responses. And what we saw there was that a lot of people would tell you that they were voting for Donald Trump. But then if a questionnaire was 20 questions long, right, and who are you going to vote for president was the third question, and then there were a bunch of follow-ups like, who do you think is honest and trustworthy? Who do you think is for people like you? Who do you think shares your values? At that point, those respondents would hang up on you. The people were happy to tell you that they were voting for Trump. They just didn't really want to tell you why. So most pollsters at that time and continue to do so until through 2020, if you didn't take the entire survey, they would just throw those responses out, right? Because they have told their client, we'll get you 800 responses. And so we need 800 responses on each of these questions. So if you didn't stay to the end to tell us if you're a Democrat or Republican or married or unmarried or whatnot, we gotta pitch the response, and it made the polls significantly worse. And I think this lines up with what people like to talk in 2016 about the shy Trump voter. I don't know how many Trump voters you've met these days. Very few of them are shy. People are happy to say that they support Donald Trump. They'll put it on their hat, they'll put it on their truck, they'll put it on their flagpole. But a lot of them don't want to spend 20 minutes talking to a stranger on the phone about why, right? And I think one of the theories that I have on this is that a lot of Trump vote is more emotional than intellectual. Right? People vote for Trump because he makes them feel good. He reflects the anger that they have about the world. He resonates with them on an emotional level, and trying to take something that is really emotional and intellectualize it through a long conversation with a stranger about politics is annoying, right? And so a lot of people would opt out. So I think that is one reason. I think another reason that the polls in 2020 in particular, the likely electorate, whenever you're doing a poll, you can survey all registered voters, but most of the time at this point in the cycle, folks are trying to figure out who we think is going to turn out and vote, which requires making a set of assumptions. It's very difficult to a likely voter screen is always as much art as science. You are relying on people's judgment. You're relying on people's expertise. You can go back and look at similar elections to try to figure out, you can ask people if they're going to vote, but that's not always very reliable information. And it's not always very reliable information in two different ways, right? Like sometimes people who are not going to vote will lie to you and tell you that they're going to vote. But also a lot of people who are going to vote will lie to you and tell you that they aren't. There's a Democratic polling firm called GQR that did an analysis. More than half of the people in their entire polling database that had ever told them that they weren't going to vote actually showed up and voted in the next election.
Oh, wow. Okay.
More than half. But they were trying to end a 20-minute call with a stranger about politics politely. And they thought if we just said, oh, no, we're not, don't worry about us, people do not go away. They keep asking you. So likely voter screens are tough. And in 2020, a lot of people got it wrong, right? And I think that looking at Democrats shifting their vote really early because of the pandemic and Republicans not, got some people over their skis. I think that the ways that a lot of Democrats who, again, took the pandemic more seriously than Republicans were just sitting around in their house waiting for a stranger to call and ask them their opinion in a way that Republicans were less likely. So I think a lot of factors sort of went into making the likely electorates a little bit off. But, I think polling was quite accurate in 2022. There was some gloom and doom among prognosticators that there's a red wave coming on the basis of some, pretty obviously partisanly motivated polls. But the high quality polls were pretty accurate. If anything, they slightly understated Democratic support. So, I think it's a really interesting question going into 2024, right? I work with people all the time talking about public opinion data, and I know for a fact that everybody I talk to in their mind is adding 3 points to the Donald Trump number, right? Like whatever they sees on Nate Cohn or 538 or whatnot, they are adding 3 points to the Trump number. And, I will acknowledge this in sometimes in our conversations, and they'll laugh and be like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. And I think that's what a lot of us are doing. And when you look at the polling average has not moved in the last month, but Democrats are completely panicking because we are all in our heads adding 3 points to the Donald Trump number because of trauma from 2016 and 2020. But there's really good reasons to think that is a bad idea, right? And I think this is one of the things that, I think is important for folks to understand is that pollsters have adapted their methodology since 2020 in order to not get caught up again. And so if your mental math is everything is methodologically is the same in 2020, so I have to add 3 points in my brain to make it work better, I think that you may be doing yourself a really big disservice, right? Because the pollsters are doing enough work to try to fix those things. It is as likely that they have overcorrected as undercorrected, right? That there's polling error all the time. Every election has error, but there's no reason to think that it is more likely to be error that benefits the Republicans than error that benefits the Democrats. If anybody listening to this can please try to take those 3 points off of their mental math for Trump, I think it will make you a better consumer of what's happening this election. Although if it makes you want to go knock on more doors, more power to you. But yeah, I think one of the big things that has changed since 2016. First of all, a lot more people are using these partial responses. The New York Times polling has talked about this. Nate Cohn has talked about this. 2024 is the first time that they're using partial responses. They didn't use them before. And I think they caught up to a lot of the analysis that we had done earlier and found like it actually makes your polls a lot worse if you don't. So you got to front load the important questions and ask them, because sometimes people will only talk to you for a minute, and you got to use that data where you can. Another place that a lot of people have changed their methodology is waiting to recalled vote. And I think this is the other thing that you and I have been talking about. And I apologize just for filibustering, but I'm going to keep talking until people have been waiting to recalled vote, which historically has made polls worse. It is not a tactic that I necessarily want to come out and say, people are waiting to recall vote, and that is great. Because if you go back,
wait, I want to hold you up for just a second here. There's a couple of points here I want to touch on, because I do want to dig into the wait on recalled vote. This is, I think, really important what's going on here. There's a couple of points here. One is that I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that part of the problem in the past was that people were just wanting to be polite and not wanting, I'm wondering if like Midwestern nice caused like a systematic upper Midwest bias in polls, where just people figuring out a way to end it, to hang up on a pollster without being rude.
Oh no, I gotta go. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Although upper Midwestern nice people are pretty partisanly split. There's both Democrats and Republicans who are nice, so it may have come out in the wash.
Another is that I've heard this sort of anecdotally that pollsters in the UK were having a similar problem, again, with polls systematically underestimating the conservative vote there. And that, they tried all sorts of things from one election to the next. And eventually a bunch of polling firms just went with, let's just add 4 points. And they had no good, methodological justification for it. It just seemed like they were just trying to correct with what keeps going wrong. And then, of course, they missed wildly as a result in the 2024 election, where actually Labor did better than anticipated. Basically.
In the UK, a lot of the analysis that this like partial response piece that it first cropped up not in the 2016 presidential election, but actually the 2015 gubernatorial election in Kentucky, where Democratic internal polls had the Democrat winning substantially. Republican internal polls had the Democrat winning substantially. Public polls, I'm talking 10-point Democratic margins across the board. Everybody thought this race was done. And then the Republican won by 9 points on election day. It was not close. And the poll said it was going to be close, but they said it wasn't going to be close in the wrong way. And I was part of the team on that. And, we did a lot of work afterward. And when we included our partial responses in the data, we came out to actually showing the Republican ahead, not by as much as he won by, but, it moved up 10 points because Matt Bevin, who's the Republican candidate for governor, was sort of a Trump-like figure in that, he lost every single editorial board endorsement in the state. He lost, a lot of Republican elected officials endorsed against him because he was the sort of uncouth, brash, speak your mind kind of a guy where, people didn't think he was honest. They didn't think he was trustworthy. They didn't think they cared, but he made them feel good. And so, we had a lot of people saying that they would vote for Matt Bevin, but when we asked why, it was because screw you, that's why, right? And then right on the heels of that was the Brexit vote in the UK. And it was a very similar dynamic where the polling on Brexit systematically understated the leave vote, again, in part because that was an emotional vote, right? People didn't have a lot of good reasons that they would articulate for why they were voting that way. They didn't really believe that it was going to save the country a bunch of money. They didn't really believe that it was going to, get all the people that they didn't like out of their town, but they believed it was going to make them feel good. And I think that is the key trend between the races where the polls get the most over their skis, is that for most people, political behavior is emotional. It's not intellectual. But the whole framework that we have to understand it, right? Your entire field of political science, half of what I do in political consulting, sort of tries to take what is fundamentally an emotional choice and dress it up in a box of intellectualism, right? And tries to rationalize it and tries to get people to think about much baser decisions intellectually. And I think that's where, our tools are set up for a kind of voting that most people don't do. That's one of my soapboxes.
No,
Thank you for letting me
I
get
think
on
that's
that.
fair, but I would say political science, and at least political psychology, definitely acknowledges that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we do tend to ascribe, and certainly a lot of political journalism does this, tends to ascribe a lot more policy stances to these things.
Yeah.
When a lot of this is, it is an emotional and decision based on a lot of just sort of past alliances and
Yeah.
who's up and who's down.
And I don't mean to make it sound like only conservatives vote emotionally. Like progressives also vote emotionally.
No.
Like, yeah, Kamala Harris is doing as well as she is because progressive voters wouldn't vote for Donald Trump if he was the last choice on earth, right? And that's not necessarily policy,
totally.
that's emotional, right?
Also, I just want to make a quick point about polling misses. As I understand it, back in 2012, the polls on average had Barack Obama ahead of Mitt Romney by about 1 point, and he ended up winning by 4. That's also a 3-point polling miss, but because it didn't change the outcome, no one really freaked out about it all that much.
Right.
2016 was a similar size error, but it was just, it actually changed the outcome, and that's what led to a lot of trauma. Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to return. You were talking about this idea of that some pollsters have decided to try this waiting on recalled vote from 2020, and that this might be a problematic practice. And I'd like you to explain, okay, what exactly is this practice and why might it be problematic?
Okay. So, and I want to, I don't know that it's problematic. Like, we may wake up on election day and find that this was exactly what people should do. But so, in a perfect world, we would not have to do any weighting and polling, right? We would randomly call numbers from the phone book, from the voter file, from whatever, and everyone would have an exactly equal likelihood of taking the survey, and we could then just say 400 random people, boom, it's going to be the right racial breakdown, it's going to be the right partisan breakdown, it's going to be the right urbanicity, but that's just not the way the world works. Some people really like to take surveys, some people really don't. The people who really like to take surveys are older and whiter and better educated. There are also people for whom politics is a bigger part of their personal identity. So it's very easy to get me to tell you my opinion. It's probably very easy to get you to tell your opinion. If you were to randomly call 400 people, you'd have way too many highly politically engaged folks who would take the survey. And you'd have way too few people who are particularly younger, people of color, but also just people who don't care that much about politics. They don't want to take a survey, so they don't. So every pollster does some degree of weighting after the fact. So functionally what that means is that they will come up and say, we should have gotten, in the 1,000 interviews that we had in this place, we should have had 100 Latinos. In fact, we had 50. So every Latino response is going to be upweighted, or basically they're going to be given the power of 2 people in the survey. And I'm simplifying the math dramatically here, but you would basically say, some people count for more because they're speaking for a larger group of people who didn't take the survey, right? So, if you know that 5% of the electorate are younger Latino voters without a college degree, and usually when pollsters say younger, we mean under 50, which doesn't always strike other people as young, but the median voter is well into their 50s in this country. So, so if you know 5% should be Latino voters without a college degree under 50, and you don't get enough of them to be represented in the sample, you start to upweight it. So what that means is that if you get a couple really weird Latino voters under 50, some people who don't represent the average that well, those errors tend to get magnified because they're playing a larger point in this. So the different things that everybody for a long time has been waiting on: race and ethnicity and age, right? So we know these are things that it's pretty easy to go to the census and say, all right, the census tells us that Ohio is 9% African-American. We need to make sure that 9% of our registered voter sample in Ohio is African-American, right? We know sort of what true is in that circumstance. So it's easy to wait to that. People have increasingly been waiting on partisan identity, right? Some people wait to registered voters, or to party registration in states where that happens. Other people wait to party self-identification. It's trickier to wait to party self-identification because we don't know what the true answer is. Partisan self-ID changes over time. So people who thought of themselves as Republicans 5 years ago, not all of them still do. So that gets into trickier terrain. In 2024, a lot of people are going even one step beyond that, though, and waiting to the number of people who say that they voted for Donald Trump or Joe Biden in 2020. So in part, this is controversial practice because it's adding another weighting rubric on there. And when you start adding more and more, so if you're waiting on age and race and party ID and previous vote and gender and education and all of these other pieces, you end up getting it so that you have already decided what the outcome of the poll is going to be before you call a single person, right? In part because you end up getting these weights that are so locked in that it would take a true political earthquake for a voter to convince you that your model for what the electorate should look like isn't correct, right? If you've decided that only people who say that they voted for Donald Trump in 2020 you're going to take seriously or as potential Trump voters in 2024, you're going to you risk missing some stuff that's going on, right? So
you're essentially it's designed to almost reproduce what happened in 2020 as a result of it, right?
It is It's sort of you have built this system that is so rigid that it can almost not fail to give you the result that you thought you were going to get when you went into it, right?
Okay.
So that's one risk. The other risk is that people are genuinely bad at remembering who they voted for, right?
Yes, we know this. Yeah.
We know this, right? Like, we know that people are more likely to report voting for the winner than really did. We also know people are more likely to report voting at all than actually did. So if you're not verifying voter, so if you're waiting to someone who tells you that they voted for Joe Biden in 2020, if you aren't going and checking if they actually showed up at all, that's a risk. The other thing is, if you're only waiting to recall vote, lots of people, the 20% of the electorate in 2024 didn't vote at all in 2020, right? Either because they weren't registered, because they didn't bother, because they've moved from state to state. And so you also get into a lot of weird areas of what do you do with these folks, right? And how seriously do you take, those opinions? So, in the past, when folks have experimented with this and added previous vote to the weighting rubrics, it has ended up making the results worse, not better. I can't think of an example where someone has gone through and done an experiment and included recalled vote as a weighting measure and not ended up with a result that was worse. A lot of pollsters will wait to party ID sort of as a replacement for this because, there are genuine differences between Democrats and Republicans on how likely they want to take surveys, right? Independents are the least likely, then Republicans, then Democrats. Historically, this cycle, however, we're seeing a different pattern. Republicans, until Joe Biden dropped out, were much more likely to want to take surveys. For a couple of weeks after Harris became the replacement candidate, then Democrats were more likely to want to take surveys. It's now gone pretty back to parity. So again, if you're building systems to solve a 2020 problem that Democrats were a lot more likely to take surveys, that's not actually the problem we're having now. So you may have overcorrected there. So I do think it's smart to use some kind of partisan self-ID or partisan ID to wait on. But I don't know that recalled vote is the right one. I think the other thing that we need to sort of grapple with is a lot of partisan pollsters use pretty sophisticated modeling for how likely people are to be Democrats or Republicans and not just how likely they are to identify. So, like, for instance, we're seeing a real trend right now in Pennsylvania where there's automatic voter registration at the Department of Motor Vehicles, where lots of new people are coming into the voter file in Pennsylvania registering as independents. Because when you're at the DMV and they just pops up the screen and you say, yes, I want to register to vote, it by default makes you an independent. So a bunch of young, diverse women in Philadelphia are being registered as independents right now. That I don't know that they're less likely to vote for Kamala Harris than a young, diverse woman in Philadelphia who is registered as a Democrat or not, right? But if you start to, as voter registration patterns are changing, you also then get into some trickier places. So a partisan source who knows this new registrant on the file is likely to be African American, is likely to live in a Democratic precinct, can take that into account and can sort of model that person correctly. But if you're a public pollster who's just going off of the voter file without all this context, you may not get it. So I think it's a risky bet that some people are making for totally understandable reasons. We will have a lot of data to know if it was a good idea in about a month. And then we'll keep arguing about it. It's a really tricky problem. And I apologize for getting so in the weeds on that. Hopefully I didn't bore all the listeners to tears.
I really appreciate you explaining this, because these are terms that get thrown around. And I want to particularly mention Nate Cohn at the New York Times had a recent piece, I'll post a link to it, that explained this, I think, reasonably well, and also got into one of the results of polling. What he found was that Trump seemed, he was particularly focusing on Florida, but just going beyond that, Trump seems to be doing substantially better than he did in past elections in some non-competitive states like Florida, like New York, like California. Now, that doesn't mean these states are remotely in play or that people should be devoting campaign resources to them, but it does mean that Republicans might have more wasted votes, quote unquote, than they have in the past. That is, votes that don't actually help them win the national contest. And this is something that Democrats usually have more of a problem with. Which could mean, it at least suggests that Republicans' Electoral College advantage may be shrinking for this election cycle, whereas they had maybe roughly a 4 percentage point advantage in 2020. That is, Democrats needed to win the popular vote by about 3 or 4 points in order to poll even in the Electoral College, where Republicans might only have like a 2 percentage point advantage now. I know this is based on polls, and the polls that we have, everyone's trying different systems to get accurate. But does this shift in the Electoral College advantage, does this sound roughly right to you?
I think so. I think in a lot of what's driving it is that polling is showing that Trump is doing a lot better with more diverse voters, particularly younger voters of color, younger Hispanic men in particular, younger African-American men in particular, where, there are a lot of those voters in New York and California and Florida. And, if we see a significant shift to the Republicans there, I think that there, a 10-point swing in younger Latino men will matter a lot more to the outcome in New York and in California than it will in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, right? Because those are just much less Latino states. So I think it's going to be an interesting thing to track. One of the states I'm curious about is New Jersey, where I think that we don't have a lot of information, but it's a big, diverse state that shares a lot of similarities with New York, where we have seen a pretty significant move. This could have big implications for the race for Congress, where there are a lot of important congressional districts in New York and California. And so, that could change the math there. I think, going back, the last time that I can recall Democrats having an advantage in the Electoral College was 2004, where George W. Bush won the popular vote. It's the last time a Republican won the popular vote. But John Kerry came within a point in Ohio, which would have been enough for him to win the Electoral College. It's interesting to think about the alternative history where a Republican had won the Electoral College and lost the popular vote in 2000, and then a Democrat did the reverse in 2004. That might have been what the American political system needed to get rid of the damn thing once and for all. But ever since then, we've gotten the idea that it helps Republicans and hurts Democrats. So a lot of people are pretending to have a commitment to the Electoral College that is more than just it helps my party, when in fact it's just like, I think once a Democrat wins the Electoral College and loses the popular vote, we'll get rid of the thing in a few minutes if it doesn't serve the interests of the Republicans any longer.
There's really no other good validation for it, but okay. Sorry, should we pivot to a discussion of pastries at this point?
I think it's about time. I have talked enough about methodology. So I think I get to ask you about pastries and let you talk for a bit. It is fall. It is the time that people go back into their kitchens. What do you do in the fall? What's your pie of choice? What's your pastry of choice when the weather starts to get cold?
I mean, it seems sort of simple and traditional, but apple pie, right around this time of year, there are so many good apples available in the stores and in farmers markets and things like that. I mean, there's so many varieties, and I love making a good apple pie. It is a nice, complex set of tasks in like making the dough, and it takes up an afternoon, and it is a lovely result, and it makes the house smell fantastic.
Do you have a go-to varietal?
I do recommend. I've played around with different varietals. I do recommend, whatever like really tasty sweet red apple I have, I try and pair it with a more tart Granny Smith, and have roughly equal parts of each. But yeah, I'll sometimes go with Envies. I'll sometimes go with Fuji's. I haven't, or Honeycrisp. I don't think I've really settled on the sweet one. I don't know about you.
Are you a two crust guy or a crumble topping?
I am a two crust guy. I like a weave. I like a nice woven crust on the top there, and
I am committed to the crumble topping.
I'll post photos, but yes.
All right.
Okay.
I love the crumble topping.
I get that. The crumble's great, but
it's like the oats and the butter and the But you're a better decorator than I am, so that makes sense that you would want to go to have that opportunity. I have recently started doing. I will make apple butter and then mix the apple butter in with the fresh apples for my pie, so that you get the sort of more intense flavors of the cooked down apples with the sort of crispness, and it's a great combination. I recommend it.
So, question for you. What is the distinction between making apple butter and making applesauce? I know they're different entities, but I don't know what exactly the difference is.
So apple butter is cooked a lot longer and has a lot less water to it. So when I make my apple butter, I will chop up apples, throw them in some apple cider vinegar, some spices, and just bake them in the oven for 5 or 6 hours, so that all of and everything gets real shriveled, and then I'll process it in the food mill. So it's much thicker. It's like consistently you can spread on toast, rather than sort of applesauce, which you would serve with, on the side.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. And I haven't figured out what, I'm planning to work with some laminated dough. I think that's maybe more of a winter task for me, in between semesters, just because, I want to get the skills right. I know it's going to be a time consuming thing. Anything else you particularly like to bake in the fall?
So I went out and bought a pumpkin, like a pie pumpkin, and I'm trying for the first time to puree my own pumpkin and get beyond the canned stuff there. So I'll report back on how that goes. Okay. But I'm going to make some pumpkin muffins. I'm going to make some pumpkin pie. I'm going to try to lean in on the pumpkin this fall.
Where are you on the whole pumpkin spice thing?
I think that cinnamon, cloves, nutmegs, like that's a classic. We've been doing that for a long time. If you want to call that pumpkin spice, cool. I like my coffee to taste like coffee, so I don't go to Starbucks for it. But those are delicious. Throw them in everything.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of leaned in to Trader Joe's pumpkin spice everything a while back, and I had a hardcore reaction at some point, and just I wanted zero pumpkin spice. I'm really not judgy about it. If you want some pumpkin spice, go knock yourself out. There's a wonderful set of flavors. It's hard for me to handle it these days.
Yeah, when I saw the pumpkin spice hummus, I thought, we may have gone too far.
No, we got to draw the line somewhere.
We may have pushed this beyond. Great.
Okay, this is really helpful. Thank you all for listening. John, thank you for your answers on this. It's really useful to know this material.
Thanks for giving me a chance to climb up on my soapbox. It's where I enjoy being the most. So.
Absolutely, this is great. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope to have a new episode for you soon, but enjoy the next week. Take care.
All right, take care.
Thank you very much for listening to Power and Flower. This episode was produced by Eli Maskett. We will be recording throughout this election season up until the November election.